The harsh Arizona sun beat down on the cemetery like Judgment Day itself. But Ruby Keller didn't notice as she knelt beside the unmarked grave, her slender fingers working the parched earth. It was 1878, and Mojave Wells was the kind of place people passed through, not where they stayed unless they were buried here. Forgotten by all except the young woman in the faded blue dress who came day after day. Ruby wiped sweat from her brow, leaving a streak of dirt across her forehead as she planted the last of her wildflowers on the small mound. This grave, like so many others, bore no name, just a crude wooden cross that would rot away in a few seasons. She didn't know who rested beneath, but that hardly mattered. The dead deserved dignity regardless. "Ain't never seen someone tend to strangers like they was kin," came a deep voice from behind her. Ruby startled, nearly toppling over as she turned to see a man atop a chestnut mare. He sat tall in the saddle, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The glare of the sun behind him cast his features in shadow, but she could make out a strong jawline dusted with stubble. "They don't have anyone else," she replied simply, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her skirt. "I'm not bothering anyone." The stranger dismounted with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life on horseback. Up close, she could see clear blue eyes studying her with curiosity rather than the judgment she'd grown accustomed to from townsfolk. "Name's Samuel Nolan," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. "Didn't mean to frighten you, madam. Ruby Keller." She nodded, keeping her distance. Strangers in Mojave Wells usually meant trouble, especially for a woman alone. "Just passing through," Samuel shook his head, replacing his hat. "Got a homestead claim about 5 miles west. Been setting up for near on 3 months now." His eyes drifted to the small collection of tools beside her: a trowel, a dented watering can, and a basket with the last few wildflowers waiting to be planted. "Those won't last long in this heat without regular water." "I come every day," she replied defensively. "Every day." He glanced around the cemetery, taking in the dozens of graves, many showing signs of her care. "That's a powerful lot of work for one person." Ruby didn't respond. She didn't owe this stranger cowboy homesteader, whatever he was, any explanation. She'd endured enough whispers from the townsfolk about her daily pilgrimages to the cemetery. To her surprise, Samuel knelt down and picked up her spare trowel. "My ma's buried back in Texas," he said quietly. "Nobody to tend her grave now that I've moved on. Reckon she'd be pleased to know I helped someone doing what I can't do for her." Ruby watched, speechless, as this stranger began digging a small hole beside an unmarked grave. "This deep enough for one of those flowers?" he asked, looking up at her with such earnestness that something inside her chest loosened just a fraction. "A bit deeper," she found herself saying. "The roots need room." They worked in silence for the next hour, planting the remaining wildflowers. Ruby found herself stealing glances at Samuel's strong, capable hands. They were calloused and weathered, but surprisingly gentle as they nestled each plant into the soil. "Why do you do it?" he finally asked as they stood to survey their work. "These people, you didn't know them, did you?" Ruby hesitated. Most people didn't understand, and she'd learned to keep her reasons to herself. But something about Samuel's direct gaze made her want to answer honestly. "My brother's buried somewhere in Nevada," she said softly. "Killed in a mining accident when I was 16. We never got word until months later, and by then—" She swallowed hard. "By then, they couldn't tell us exactly where they'd put him, just that he was in the company cemetery. I like to think someone might look after his grave, even if they don't know who he is." She met Samuel's eyes. "So I do the same here." Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "That's a kindness not many would think to give. The marshal says I'm morbid, Ruby admitted with a wry smile. "Most folks in town cross the street when they see me coming." "Most folks are fools then," Samuel replied with such conviction that Ruby felt her cheeks warm. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the cemetery in gold and amber, Samuel gathered her tools. "May I walk you back to town, Miss Keller?" Ruby hesitated. "That's not necessary." "I know," he said with a small smile, "but I'd like to all the same." Something about his steady presence made her nod in agreement. As they walked the dusty path back toward Mojave Wells, Ruby felt lighter somehow. For the first time in the 2 years since she'd started her cemetery visits, she hadn't carried the burden alone. What she didn't know then was how profoundly this chance meeting would change both their lives. The next morning, Ruby woke before dawn, as was her habit. She shared a small room above the millinery shop where she worked as a seamstress. Mrs. Collins, the shop owner, had been the only person in town willing to hire Ruby when she'd arrived in Mojave Wells, alone and with little more than the clothes on her back. Ruby dressed quickly in the dim light, splashing water on her face from the basin. Her auburn hair, usually kept in a tight braid during work hours, hung loose around her shoulders as she prepared for her morning visit to the cemetery before her shift began. She was surprised to find Samuel waiting at the edge of town, a burlap sack in hand and his horse tethered nearby. "Mr. Nolan," she acknowledged, trying to hide her confusion. "You're up early." "Samuel, please," he corrected with a smile. "And I'm usually up before the roosters." "Ranch work doesn't wait for the sun." He lifted the sack slightly. "Brought something that might help with your flowers." Curiosity overcame her caution. "What is it?" "Fertilizer from my compost heap. Mixed it with some of the better soil from the creek bed near my place." He looked almost shy as he added, "Those wildflowers will stand a better chance with it." Ruby was momentarily speechless. In 2 years, not a single person had offered to help with her cemetery work. "That's very thoughtful," she managed. They walked together in the cool morning air, the town still quiet around them. Ruby found herself stealing glances at Samuel's profile. In the soft dawn light, she could see details she'd missed yesterday: a small scar above his right eyebrow, laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Have you always been a rancher?" she asked, breaking the companionable silence. Samuel adjusted his hat. "Started as a drover, moving cattle up from Texas after the war. Did that for nearly 10 years before deciding it was time to stake my own claim." He glanced at her. "What about you? Always been a seamstress?" Ruby shook her head. "I was training to be a schoolteacher before." She hesitated. "Before my brother died. After that, plans changed." At the cemetery, Samuel helped Ruby water the previous day's plantings before they began work on a new section. He spread his special soil mixture around each flower they'd planted. "My father used to say that flowers are messages from the living to those who have passed on," Samuel remarked as they worked side by side. "A way of saying they're not forgotten." Ruby looked up, surprised by the sentiment. "That's beautiful. My father wasn't much for beautiful thoughts." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Samuel didn't press, but his eyes held understanding. As the sun climbed higher, Ruby reluctantly gathered her tools. "I have to get to the shop," she explained. "Mrs. Collins is expecting a large order of hats to be trimmed today." Samuel nodded. "Would it be presumptuous of me to come back tomorrow? I've got more of this soil mix, and there are still plenty of graves that could use attention." Ruby hesitated. She'd guarded her solitude carefully since arriving in Mojave Wells, keeping everyone at a distance. But Samuel's offer seemed genuine, without the usual pity or curiosity that motivated most people's interest in her. Not presumptuous, she finally said. I'd welcome the help. His smile warmed her more than the morning sun. Tomorrow, then. True to his word, Samuel returned the next day and the day after that. Their routine quickly established itself, meeting at dawn, working side by side in comfortable conversation, parting when Ruby needed to start her workday. Sometimes they spoke of serious things, Samuel's experiences in the war, Ruby's dreams of one day opening her own dress shop, but often they simply enjoyed the peaceful companionship of shared purpose. A week into their newfound friendship, Mrs. Collins cornered Ruby in the back room of the millinery. "That cowboy of yours has got the whole town talking," she said without preamble, her eyes twinkling with interest. "He's not my cowboy," Ruby protested, focusing intently on the hat she was trimming. "Mr. Nolan is simply kind enough to help with the cemetery." Mrs. Collins snorted. "Kind, is it? A handsome man like that doesn't spend his mornings planting flowers on strangers' graves unless there's something or someone drawing him there." She patted Ruby's shoulder. "It's good to see you with a friend, dear. You've been alone too long." Ruby wanted to dismiss the older woman's insinuations, but something fluttered in her chest at the thought of Samuel seeking out her company specifically. She'd been careful not to read too much into his kindness, knowing how rare genuine friendship was, especially for someone like her with her peculiar habits. That afternoon, as Ruby was closing the shop, she was surprised to see Samuel waiting outside, his horse nowhere in sight. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, suddenly seeming less sure of himself than she'd ever seen him. "I thought you might allow me to walk you to supper at the hotel restaurant." Ruby blinked in surprise. "Supper with me?" A smile tugged at the corner of Samuel's mouth. "Unless you've got another engagement." The idea of Samuel Nolan asking her to dine with him publicly in Mojave Wells' only proper restaurant was so unexpected that Ruby found herself momentarily lost for words. "I'm not dressed for the hotel restaurant," she finally said, gesturing to her simple work dress. "You look perfect to me," Samuel replied with such sincerity that Ruby felt her resolve weaken. "People will talk," she warned. Samuel stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly. "Let them. I've been wanting to have a meal with you where neither of us is covered in dirt or rushing off to work." He offered his arm. "What do you say, Miss Keller? Will you do me the honor?" Looking up into those earnest blue eyes, Ruby found she couldn't refuse. She slipped her hand into the crook of his arm, ignoring the stares of passers-by as they walked toward the hotel. The hotel restaurant was modest by big city standards, but it was the finest establishment in Mojave Wells. Ruby was acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way as the waiter led them to a table near the window. "I've never actually eaten here before," she admitted quietly as they settled into their seats. "Neither have I," Samuel confessed. "Been saving my money for fencing and livestock. But I sold a few horses to the stage company yesterday, and I wanted to celebrate." They ordered the special beef stew with fresh bread, and as they ate, Ruby found herself relaxing despite the occasional whispers from nearby tables. "May I ask you something personal?" Samuel said after they'd been served apple pie for dessert. Ruby nodded cautiously. "How did you come to be in Mojave Wells? It's not exactly on the main routes, and you mentioned your family was from somewhere else." Ruby set down her fork, considering how much to share. She'd kept her story close all these years, but something about Samuel made her want to unburden herself. "After my brother died, things got difficult at home," she began carefully. "My father turned to drink and my mother retreated into herself. I stayed as long as I could, but eventually I had to leave." She took a deep breath. "I had a cousin who'd settled in Prescott. I was heading there when the stagecoach broke an axle outside Mojave Wells. While waiting for repairs, I met Mrs. Collins, who mentioned needing help in her shop. It seemed like Providence. And your cousin in Prescott? I wrote to her once I was settled, but never received a reply. Ruby shrugged slightly. By then, I'd found my purpose here with the cemetery. Samuel's hand moved across the table, briefly touching hers. I'm glad the stagecoach broke down, he said softly. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Marshal Jenkins at their table, his imposing figure casting a shadow over their desserts. Evening, Nolan, he said gruffly, before turning his attention to Ruby. Miss Keller, Mrs. Wilson has been complaining again about your activities disturbing her dear departed husband's rest. Ruby stiffened. I've done nothing but plant flowers on his grave, Marshal. Be that as it may, she's threatening to bring it to the town council if you don't stop. The Marshal's expression held the weary resignation of a man caught between warring factions. Maybe best you limit your attentions to the unclaimed plots. Before Ruby could respond, Samuel spoke up. With respect, Marshal, there's no law against tending graves, even those with families still around. If Mrs. Wilson objects to flowers beautifying her husband's final resting place, perhaps she should visit more often than Christmas and Easter. The Marshal's eyebrows rose at Samuel's defense. He studied the cowboy for a long moment before giving a barely perceptible nod. Just passing along the message, he said, before touching his hat brim and departing. Ruby stared at Samuel, a mixture of gratitude and concern washing over her. You shouldn't have done that. The Marshal has influence in these parts. So do I, Samuel replied evenly. I may be new to Mojave Wells, but I've already made contracts with the stage line and several local businesses. Besides, he added with a hint of a smile, someone needs to stand up for what you're doing. It's a kindness, not a crime. As they walked back toward Ruby's lodgings in the gathering dusk, she felt something shifting between them, a deeper understanding, perhaps, or the beginnings of something she'd long ago stopped believing possible for herself. At her door, Samuel removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. I'd like to call on you properly, Ruby, not just at the cemetery. Her heart quickened at his use of her given name. You mean court me? Yes, he said simply, if you'd allow it. Ruby studied his face in the lamplight spilling from the millinery window. There was no pity there, no fascination with the town oddity, just honest admiration and something warmer that made her breath catch. I would allow it, she replied softly. Samuel's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. Tomorrow, then, the cemetery at dawn, as usual, Ruby nodded, suddenly shy. Good night, Samuel. Good night, Ruby, he replied, and though he didn't touch her, the way he spoke her name felt as intimate as a caress. She watched him walk away, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness, and for the first time in years, Ruby Keller allowed herself to hope for something beyond the solitary life she'd built. The next morning brought clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rare summer rain. Ruby met Samuel at the cemetery gate, a basket of fresh cuttings from Mrs. Collins' garden in hand. Mrs. Collins says these cuttings will take root if we plant them now before the rain, she explained as they walked among the graves. She's been unusually generous lately. Ruby cast a knowing look at Samuel. I suspect she approves of you. Smart woman, Samuel replied with a grin. I brought something too. He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small bundle wrapped in burlap. Unwrapping it, he revealed several carved wooden markers. Ruby gasped softly as she examined them. Each was simple but beautifully made, with unknown but not forgotten carved in careful letters. For the unmarked graves, Samuel explained. I made them last night. Couldn't sleep, thinking about all those people with nothing to mark their passing. Ruby traced the letters with her fingertips, emotion tightening her throat. Samuel, this means so much. Just the first batch, he said, watching her face with quiet intensity. I'll make more. They worked steadily as the air grew heavy with impending rain. Samuel dug the holes for Ruby's cuttings while she placed his markers on the graves that had no crosses or stones. Tell me about your ranch, she said as they worked. What are your plans for it? Samuel's face lit up with enthusiasm. It's good land with a year-round spring. I'm running about 30 head of cattle now, but I've got space for 3 times that many once I finish the north pasture fencing. He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. Built the cabin myself. It's not fancy, but it's solid. 2 rooms now, but I designed it to be expanded. The implication hung in the air between them. Ruby felt her cheeks warm as she realized he was describing not just a ranch, but a potential home. Thunder rumbled in the distance as they finished planting the last of the cuttings. Fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning the parched earth dark. We should get back, Ruby called over the increasing patter of rain. Instead of hurrying toward town, Samuel took her hand and led her toward a small mausoleum, the only substantial structure in the cemetery. They ducked inside just as the skies opened completely. The mausoleum was cool and dim, with just enough light filtering through its small stained glass window to see. They stood close together, listening to the rain drumming on the stone roof. I've never been in here before, Ruby admitted, looking around at the austere interior. It belongs to the founder of Mojave Wells. Samuel was looking not at their surroundings but at her, his gaze so intent that Ruby's breath caught. Raindrops glistened in his dark hair and on his shoulders. You've got mud, he said softly, reaching up to brush a smudge from her cheek. His touch lingered, and Ruby found herself leaning into his hand ever so slightly. The air between them seemed to crackle with possibility. Ruby, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. May I? Yes, she breathed before he could finish. His lips met hers, gentle at first, then with growing certainty as she responded. Ruby had been kissed before, awkward, fumbling encounters with a boy back home, but nothing like this. Samuel's kiss spoke of longing and promise, sending warmth coursing through her despite the cool air. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since the first day I saw you kneeling by that grave, looking like some kind of garden angel. Ruby laughed softly. A muddy, sweaty garden angel. The most beautiful sight I'd ever seen, he insisted, tucking a strand of damp hair behind her ear. They stayed in the mausoleum, talking in low voices as the rain continued to pour outside. Samuel told her about his family in Texas, his 3 sisters all married with children. His father long dead from a war wound that never healed right, his mother who'd passed 2 winters ago from pneumonia. Ruby shared more about her brother James, how he'd been the family peacemaker, always stepping between Ruby and their father's temper, how his death had shattered what fragile harmony existed in their home. I used to be angry that he left, she confessed. Went west chasing silver when we needed him at home. It took me years to forgive him. Is that why you started tending the graves? Samuel asked gently. As a way to forgive, Ruby considered this. Perhaps, or maybe to atone for not being able to tend his. She looked up at Samuel through damp lashes. Until you came along, I thought I was the only one who understood that the dead still deserve care, even when they're strangers. The rain eventually slowed to a gentle patter, and they emerged from their shelter to find the cemetery transformed. The newly planted flowers glistened with raindrops, and Samuel's wooden markers stood proudly against the wet earth. I'll be late for work, Ruby realized, suddenly remembering the world beyond their private cocoon. I'll explain to Mrs. Collins, Samuel offered, taking her hand as they hurried back toward town. The streets of Mojave Wells had turned to mud, but neither of them minded. Ruby felt lighter somehow, as if the rain had washed away more than just dust. Outside the millinery, Samuel reluctantly released her hand. "May I call on you tomorrow evening? Perhaps we could walk after supper." Ruby nodded, suddenly shy again despite the intimacy they'd shared. "I'd like that." His smile was warm enough to chase away the rain chill. "Until tomorrow, then." As Ruby watched him go, Mrs. Collins appeared beside her, a knowing look on her face. "That boy's sweet on you," she observed. "And judging by that smile you're trying to hide, the feeling's mutual." Ruby touched her lips, still tingling from Samuel's kiss. "Is it that obvious?" "Clear as day, Mrs. Collins replied with satisfaction. "And about time, too. Now come inside and get dry before customers arrive." The next few weeks passed in a sweet haze for Ruby. Mornings were spent with Samuel at the cemetery, planting flowers and placing his increasingly elaborate markers on the forgotten graves. Evenings found them walking along the edges of town, talking of everything and nothing, their hands naturally finding each other as twilight descended. Word spread quickly in Mojave Wells. The strange girl who tended graves and the handsome rancher who courted her became a topic of fascination. Some, like Mrs. Collins, approved wholeheartedly. Others, like Mrs. Wilson and her circle of church ladies, sniffed disapprovingly at what they considered an unsuitable match. "She spends more time with the dead than the living," Ruby overheard Mrs. Wilson tell the general store owner one afternoon. What kind of wife would that make for a respectable rancher? The word stung. But when she mentioned them to Samuel that evening as they sat on the edge of town watching the sunset, he merely laughed. "Respectable? Me?" He shook his head. "I was driving cattle and sleeping under the stars while those ladies were having tea parties. Besides," he added, his expression growing serious, "your kindness toward those who can no longer thank you shows the kind of heart you have. That's worth more than any so-called respectability." As summer deepened into early autumn, Samuel began bringing Ruby to his ranch on Sundays after church. The first time she saw the cabin he'd built, nestled among cottonwoods near the spring, she understood why he spoke of it with such pride. Though simple, it showed careful craftsmanship in every detail, from the smooth, planed floors to the stone fireplace that dominated one wall. "It needs a woman's touch," he admitted as he showed her around. "But I've got good bones to work with." Ruby ran her hand along a windowsill, imagining curtains hanging there, perhaps ones she'd sewn herself. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. "You've done remarkable work," she said sincerely. "It's a beautiful home, Samuel." His expression softened at her words. "Could be our home someday," he said quietly. "If you wanted that." Ruby's heart skipped a beat. Though they'd been courting for nearly 2 months now, neither had spoken explicitly of marriage. The possibility hung between them, unspoken but ever present. "I'm not sure I'd make a very good rancher's wife," she said hesitantly. "I don't know the first thing about cattle or chickens." Samuel moved closer, taking her hands in his. "But you know about persistence and care. About showing up day after day to do what needs doing, even when no one else understands why." He smiled slightly. "Ranching isn't so different from tending graves in that way." Ruby laughed despite herself. "I'm not sure that comparison will convince those church ladies I'm suitable." "To hell with the church ladies," Samuel said with unexpected vehemence. "I'm not asking them to marry me." Ruby's breath caught. "Are you asking me?" Samuel's eyes widened as he realized what he'd said. For a moment he looked panicked, then his expression resolved into determination. Still holding her hands, he lowered himself to one knee on the cabin floor. "This isn't how I planned it," he confessed. "I've got a ring in town being sized. Was going to take you on a picnic next weekend and do this properly." "Samuel," Ruby whispered, her heart pounding. "Ruby Keller," he continued, his voice steadying. "I've known since that first day watching you care for those forgotten souls that you were someone special, someone with a heart big enough to love without expecting anything in return." He squeezed her hands gently. "I'm asking you to share your life with mine, to help me build something here that will last, to be my wife, my partner, my love for all our days." He looked up at her, vulnerability and hope mingled in his eyes. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Ruby's eyes as she nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Finally, she managed a choked yes. Samuel rose and pulled her into his arms, his kiss conveying all the joy words couldn't express. When they finally parted, both were laughing and crying at once. "I don't have the ring yet," he apologized. "I don't need a ring," Ruby assured him, resting her hand against his chest where his heart beat strong and steady. "I just need you." They were married on a crisp October morning, with the cottonwoods along the creek turning gold. The ceremony was small. Mrs. Collins stood as Ruby's witness, while Samuel's foreman Tucker served as his. Ruby wore a dress of pale blue that she'd sewn herself, with lace trim salvaged from an old tablecloth. Samuel looked handsome and slightly uncomfortable in a new suit, his usually windswept hair tamed for the occasion. To Ruby's surprise, most of Mojave Wells turned out for the wedding. Even Mrs. Wilson attended, though she maintained a skeptical expression throughout the ceremony. "Folks are curious," Mrs. Collins explained as she helped Ruby prepare that morning. "No one expected Samuel Nolan to settle for anyone in these parts, let alone," she stopped abruptly. "Let alone the strange girl who tends graves," Ruby finished with a wry smile. Mrs. Collins patted her hand. "Their loss for not seeing what he saw in you from the start, dear." After the ceremony and modest reception at the hotel, Samuel drove Ruby to the ranch, their home now. He had surprised her by adding a small lean-to greenhouse to the cabin, filled with cuttings from all the flowers they'd been planting in the cemetery. "For winter," he explained as he showed her the structure. "So you can keep growing beauty even when the ground's too hard for planting." Ruby's heart swelled with love for this man who understood her so completely. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered each other in new ways, their passion tempered by tenderness as they learned the language of each other's bodies. Afterward, lying in Samuel's arms as moonlight filtered through the cabin window, Ruby marveled at how her life had changed in just a few short months. "What are you thinking?" Samuel murmured against her hair. "That I never expected to be this happy," she admitted. "After James died, I thought that was it for me, that my life would always be defined by loss." Samuel's arms tightened around her. "And now I know better," Ruby said, turning to face him. "Life doesn't stop with grief. It grows around it like flowers on a grave." Samuel smiled, tracing her cheek with gentle fingers. "My poet wife." "Your strange wife who still intends to tend graves," she clarified. "Marriage won't change that about me." "I would never want it to," he assured her. "In fact, I've been thinking." "Yes." "The cemetery's getting crowded, and that hillside on our land near the creek would make a fine spot for a new one." He watched her expression carefully. "Properly maintained, with real markers and permanent plantings. Somewhere people could be laid to rest with dignity, even if they're strangers passing through." Ruby stared at him, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of such a suggestion. "You do that, give up good grazing land for a cemetery. For you," Samuel kissed her softly, "I'd give up far more. Besides, it would only be a small portion and it would mean something to this community. A proper place for everyone, not just those who can afford the town plots." Ruby buried her face against his chest, overcome with emotion. "I love you, Samuel Nolan," she whispered. "More than I have words to say." "Show me," he murmured, and she did, with hands and lips and the press of her body against his, their passion reigniting in the quiet darkness of their wedding night. Winter came early that year, with the first frost appearing before Thanksgiving. Ruby adapted to ranch life with determination if not immediate skill. She learned to milk the cow Samuel had purchased as a wedding gift, to collect eggs without agitating the chickens, and to cook on the temperamental wood stove that dominated their kitchen. Samuel was a patient teacher and an appreciative husband, praising her efforts even when they resulted in disaster, like the first loaf of bread that could have served as a building stone, or the time she accidentally left the chicken coop open and spent hours helping him round up the escaped birds. Through it all, they continued their cemetery work. When the ground grew too hard for planting, they focused on maintaining the existing graves and planning for spring. Samuel built a small workshop behind the cabin where he crafted increasingly elaborate markers for the unmarked graves, each one unique. Ruby spent hours in her greenhouse, nurturing seedlings for the spring planting and experimenting with flowers that might survive the harsh desert conditions. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Ruby often sewing or mending while Samuel read aloud from one of the books Mrs. Collins had given them as a wedding gift. It was during one such evening in early December that Ruby realized she'd missed her monthly course for the second time. She set aside her sewing, her hand drifting unconsciously to her stomach. Samuel noticed her distraction. "Everything all right, love?" Ruby hesitated, not wanting to raise hopes prematurely but unable to keep such a possibility to herself. "I think I might be with child." The book dropped from Samuel's hands as he stared at her, joy and disbelief warring on his face. "Are you certain?" "Not entirely," she admitted, "but all the signs are there." Samuel crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before her chair and placing his hand reverently over hers on her still flat abdomen. "A baby," he whispered. "Our baby." The wonder in his voice brought tears to Ruby's eyes. "If I am with child, it would come in summer, I think." Samuel's smile was radiant. A summer baby born among the flowers. He leaned forward to kiss her with such tenderness that Ruby felt her heart might burst with happiness. By Christmas, there was no longer any doubt. Ruby's condition became their precious secret, shared only with Mrs. Collins, who promised to help with the necessary preparations. The new year of 1879 brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Ruby found herself grateful for the greenhouse, where she could escape cabin fever and continue nurturing her plants. Her body changed gradually, the slight swell of her abdomen a constant source of fascination for both her and Samuel. "What shall we name him?" Samuel asked one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her growing belly. "Him. Are you so certain it's a boy?" Ruby teased. "Just a feeling," Samuel admitted, "though a little girl with your auburn hair would be a blessing too." Ruby considered for a moment. "If it's a boy, perhaps James, after my brother." Samuel nodded solemnly. "James it is, and for a girl, Elizabeth," Ruby suggested, "after your mother." "James or Elizabeth Nolan," Samuel said, testing the names. "Strong names for a strong child." As winter gave way to spring, Ruby's pregnancy became more pronounced. The women of Mojave Wells, even Mrs. Wilson, softened toward her with this evidence of her embracing a more traditional female role. Gifts began appearing: a hand-knitted blanket, tiny clothes, a rocking chair delivered to the ranch by the blacksmith who refused payment. "Seems you've won them over," Samuel observed as Ruby arranged the latest offerings in the corner they were preparing for the baby. "Not me," Ruby corrected. The baby. There's something about new life that makes people forget their prejudices. Samuel wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands cradling her rounded belly. Speaking of new life, Tucker and I finished clearing that hillside yesterday. Ruby turned in his arms, her eyes brightening. For the cemetery, Samuel nodded. Come see. He led her carefully up the gentle slope beyond the creek, where a clearing had been made among the juniper and pinyon pines. The site commanded a view of the valley below and the distant mountains beyond. It's perfect, Ruby breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. Peaceful. I thought we could plant flowering trees along the boundaries, Samuel suggested. And perhaps wildflowers throughout, so it's always in bloom. Ruby's eyes filled with tears at his thoughtfulness. A place of beauty, not just remembrance. Exactly. Samuel squeezed her hand. I've already spoken to the marshal about making it official. He thinks the town council will approve, especially since the current cemetery is nearly full. By late April, the new cemetery had been consecrated in a small ceremony attended by most of Mojave Wells. Ruby, now visibly pregnant, stood proudly beside Samuel as the preacher blessed the ground. Mojave Wells Memorial Gardens, the marshal announced, unveiling the sign Samuel had crafted. Open to all, regardless of means or station. There was genuine appreciation in the crowd's response. Even Mrs. Wilson approached Ruby afterward. It's a fine thing you and your husband have done, she admitted grudgingly. My Henry would have appreciated the view. Ruby accepted the compliment with grace. You're welcome to help us plant flowers on his new plot once we've transferred him. We plan to move all the existing graves properly, with full ceremonies. Mrs. Wilson looked surprised at the invitation. I might do that. Henry always did like daffodils. The conversation marked a turning point in Ruby's relationship with the town. No longer was she the strange girl obsessed with the dead. Now she was Mrs. Nolan, expectant mother and co-founder of the Memorial Gardens. People began seeking her advice on proper memorials, and even on what flowers might grow best on their loved ones' graves. As Ruby's time drew near, the summer heat intensified. She continued to work in the greenhouse and gardens, though Samuel insisted she rest during the hottest parts of the day. The baby will come when it's ready, Mrs. Collins assured her during a visit in early July. First ones often take their time. Ready or not, labor began on a sweltering night in mid-July. Samuel rode frantically for the midwife while Ruby paced the cabin floor, breathing through the increasingly powerful contractions. By dawn, both midwife and Mrs. Collins were in attendance, guiding Ruby through the final stages of labor. Samuel had been banished to the porch, where he wore a path in the boards with his anxious pacing. When the piercing cry of a newborn finally cut through the morning air, Samuel froze, his heart pounding. The door opened, and Mrs. Collins emerged, her face wreathed in smiles. "Congratulations, Mr. Nolan," she said. "You have a fine son." Samuel entered the bedroom in a daze to find Ruby propped against pillows, a small bundle in her arms. Her hair was damp with sweat, her face flushed, but the smile she gave him was radiant. "Come meet your son," she whispered. Samuel approached the bed on unsteady legs, overcome with emotion as he gazed down at the tiny red face partially visible among the blankets. The baby had a shock of dark hair and, as Samuel watched in wonder, opened eyes of startling blue. "He has your eyes," Ruby said softly. "And your strength," Samuel replied, his voice rough with emotion as he sat carefully on the edge of the bed. "He's perfect, Ruby, absolutely perfect. Would you like to hold him?" She carefully transferred the bundle to Samuel's arms, showing him how to support the baby's head. Samuel cradled his son with awe, tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks. "Hello, James," he whispered. "I'm your pa." The baby gazed up at him solemnly, tiny fingers flexing against the blanket. Samuel felt a love so profound it nearly brought him to his knees. "I'll protect you," he promised the infant. "You and your ma both for all my days." Ruby watched them together, her heart so full she thought it might burst. From tending forgotten graves to creating this new life, the journey seemed impossible, yet here they were. "I was thinking," she said quietly, "perhaps his full name should be James Samuel Nolan." Samuel looked up, surprised and touched. "You want to name him after me too? After the kindest, most honorable man I've ever known," Ruby confirmed. "So he has a legacy to live up to." Samuel leaned forward carefully, mindful of the precious bundle in his arms, to kiss his wife tenderly. "Thank you for our son," he murmured against her lips. "For our family." The weeks following James's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy. The baby thrived, growing steadily and developing a strong pair of lungs that he exercised frequently. Ruby and Samuel adjusted to parenthood with the same determination they brought to all their endeavors, supporting each other through sleepless nights and learning the language of their child's different cries. By August, Ruby had recovered enough to resume light duties around the ranch and to visit their cemetery project. The first of the transferred graves had been completed, with Samuel's handcrafted markers replacing the crude crosses from the old cemetery. On a particularly fine morning, Ruby carried James in a sling against her chest as she and Samuel walked among the newly established plots. Many now bore flowers, some planted by Ruby and Samuel, others by family members who had embraced the idea of the garden cemetery. "It's becoming what we imagined," Ruby said, surveying their work with satisfaction. "A place of peace and remembrance." "And beauty," Samuel added, his arm around her waist as they stood atop the hill, looking out over the valley. "Thanks to you." Ruby leaned against him, their son sleeping peacefully between them. "Thanks to us," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." "Nor I," Samuel admitted. "Finding you tending those graves was the best thing that ever happened to me, Ruby Nolan." She smiled up at him, this man who had seen value in her strange devotion and helped transform it into something that benefited their entire community. Who would have thought flowers on forgotten graves would lead to all this? Samuel's gaze encompassed their son, the flourishing cemetery, and the ranch beyond the life they had built together from unlikely beginnings. "Perhaps those forgotten souls brought us together," he suggested. "Their final gift to the living." Ruby considered this with a thoughtful smile. "I'd like to think so." She touched a wildflower blooming beside a new grave. Life and death, all part of the same cycle, beauty growing from loss. As they walked back toward home, the morning sun warm on their backs and their son beginning to stir against Ruby's chest, she felt a profound sense of rightness. The path that had led her here through grief and loneliness to love and family had been unpredictable and sometimes painful, but standing here now, she wouldn't change a moment of it. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "That sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to exactly where we're meant to be," Ruby replied, squeezing his hand. "And I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Samuel's answering smile held all the promise of their shared future days of hard work and quiet joy, challenges overcome together, and love that had blossomed like wildflowers in the most unlikely of places. 5 years passed, bringing changes to both the Nolan family and Mojave Wells itself. The town had grown steadily, with the arrival of the railroad spur line connecting it to larger settlements. The Nolan Ranch prospered under Samuel's careful management, expanding to include a successful horse breeding operation alongside the cattle. Ruby had given birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years after James, and the children brought endless joy and occasional chaos to their lives. Now aged 5 and 3, they were fixtures at the memorial gardens, helping their mother plant flowers and listening to their father tell stories about the people resting there. What had begun as Ruby's solitary mission had evolved into a family tradition and then a community institution. The Mojave Wells Memorial Gardens had become known throughout the territory for its beauty and unique approach to honoring the dead. Families from neighboring towns sometimes brought their loved ones to be buried there, attracted by the peaceful setting and perpetual care Ruby and Samuel provided. On a warm afternoon in September 1884, Ruby sat on a bench beneath the largest cottonwood in the cemetery, watching James carefully water a newly planted rosebush while Elizabeth toddled after butterflies among the gravestones. "Mama, whose flower is this?" James asked, pointing to the rosebush. "That belongs to Mr. Peterson, who was a station master back east before he came west," Ruby explained. "His daughter brought the cutting all the way from Philadelphia because roses were his favorite." James nodded solemnly, taking his cemetery duties as seriously as a 5-year-old could. "I'll take extra good care of it then." Ruby smiled at her son's earnestness. He had Samuel's thoughtful nature and her own sense of responsibility toward the memorials they tended. The sound of horseback approaching drew her attention. Samuel appeared at the cemetery entrance, dismounting with the ease of a lifelong rider. Elizabeth spotted him immediately. "Papa," she cried, abandoning her butterfly chase to run toward him on sturdy little legs. Samuel scooped her up, settling her on his shoulders as he walked toward Ruby and James. Even after years of marriage, the sight of him still made Ruby's heart skip a beat. The sun had weathered his face, and work had hardened his body, but his eyes held the same warmth they had on that first day in the old cemetery. "How are my garden angels today?" he asked, lowering Elizabeth to the ground and ruffling James's hair. "We're planting Mr. Peterson's rose," James informed him importantly. "It came all the way from Philadelphia." "Philadelphia," Ruby corrected gently. "And you're doing a fine job." Samuel sat beside Ruby on the bench, watching their children return to their tasks. "Got a letter from the territorial governor today," he said quietly. "He's heard about our cemetery and wants to visit next month when he passes through." Ruby raised her eyebrows in surprise. "The governor? Whatever for?" "Seems he's proposing legislation about proper burial grounds for all communities, regardless of size." Samuel took her hand, squeezing it gently. "He wants to see what we've done here as a model." Pride warmed Ruby's chest. What had begun as her personal mission to honor forgotten souls had grown into something that might influence territory-wide policy. "Who would have thought?" she murmured. "I would," Samuel replied promptly. "I knew from the start you were doing something special, even if others couldn't see it." Ruby leaned against his shoulder, watching as James carefully showed Elizabeth how to water without disturbing the flowers. "We've come a long way from that first day." "And we've miles yet to go," Samuel added, his arm sliding around her waist. "I've been thinking about expanding the greenhouse. With the railroad bringing in more supplies, we could grow exotic flowers year-round." Ruby smiled at his enthusiasm. "Always planning ahead, aren't you?" "Someone has to," he teased. "You'd give away every bloom we grow if left to your own devices." "They bring more joy in the ground than in a vase," Ruby defended, though her eyes twinkled. Their playful debate was interrupted by Elizabeth's excited squeal. "Look, look what I found!" The little girl came running, something clutched carefully in her small hands. She opened them to reveal a butterfly with brilliant blue wings, temporarily stunned but unharmed. "It's beautiful, Lizzie," Ruby said. "But we should let it go. Butterflies need to be free to find flowers." "Like the ones we plant?" Elizabeth asked, wide-eyed. "Exactly like those," Samuel confirmed. "Without butterflies, many flowers couldn't grow at all. They help each other." Elizabeth considered this, then carefully raised her hands. The butterfly sat motionless for a moment before fluttering its wings and taking flight. The little girl watched in wonder as it rose into the clear blue sky. "It's saying thank you," James told his sister confidently. As the children returned to their explorations, Samuel pulled Ruby closer against his side. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said softly, his lips near her ear. "Mrs. Wilson came by the ranch yesterday while you were in town." Ruby tensed slightly. Though relations with the older woman had improved dramatically over the years, there remained a certain wariness between them. "What did she want?" Samuel's expression grew solemn. "She's dying, Ruby. Consumption. The doctor gives her a few months at most." Ruby's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, poor Mrs. Wilson." "She wants to be buried here next to Henry," Samuel continued. "But more than that, she asked specifically if you would choose the flowers for her grave." Tears sprang to Ruby's eyes. After all the years of disapproval, Mrs. Wilson's request felt like the final acknowledgement of Ruby's gift. "Did she say why?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Samuel nodded. "She said she'd watched how the plants you choose seem to suit each person, even those you never knew in life. She wants that same care for herself." He paused, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "She also apologized for how she treated you when you first came to town. Said she'd been wrong about you." Ruby blinked back tears, watching as James and Elizabeth moved among the graves, their small hands touching the markers with reverence. "I'll plant lilacs for her," she decided. "She always wears lilac water, and the blooms are both beautiful and hardy. They'll come back year after year." Samuel pressed a kiss to her temple. "You have a gift, Ruby Nolan, not just for growing things, but for seeing the beauty in what others overlook." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the memorial gardens, Ruby stood with her family at the highest point of the cemetery. Below them, Mojave Wells spread out in the valley, while behind them, the Nolan Ranch stretched toward the horizon. "Time to head home," Samuel announced. "Cook has promised us apple pie for supper if we're not late." The children needed no further encouragement, racing ahead down the path toward home. Samuel offered Ruby his arm, and they followed at a more sedate pace. "Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out?" Ruby asked as they walked. "If you hadn't come upon me that day in the cemetery." Samuel considered this for a moment. "I believe some things are meant to be, Ruby. I might have found you another way, or you might have found me, but our paths were destined to cross." Ruby smiled at his certainty. "Because of the graves, because of your heart," he corrected. "And maybe because somewhere those forgotten souls were looking out for both of us." As they reached the ranch house, with its expanded rooms and wide porch where the children already waited impatiently, Ruby paused to look back at the hill where the memorial gardens caught the last golden rays of sunset. The flowers they'd planted glowed like jewels among the graves, a living testament to the beauty that could grow from remembrance. "I never expected to find happiness tending graves," she said softly. "But I found you and our children and a purpose that matters." Samuel's arm tightened around her waist. "And I found the most extraordinary woman I've ever known, with a heart big enough to care for those who could never thank her." He turned her gently to face him, his eyes reflecting all the love that had grown between them over the years. "That's worth more than all the gold in Arizona territory." As they joined their children on the porch, the sun dipping below the western mountains, Ruby knew that their story, born among forgotten graves and nurtured like the wildflowers, they'd planted together would continue to bloom for many years to come. A legacy of love and remembrance, as enduring as the markers Samuel carved and as beautiful as the gardens Ruby tended, passing from one generation to the next like seeds carried on the desert wind.